By the time 1850 rolls around, America does now go from one ocean to the other. So much territory has been added, either through by taking or by buying or a combination of both. Now the United States goes from sea to shining sea. But this does not mean the problems are over. In fact, it means the problems are now going to be even more magnified because the issue of slavery has not been really finalized. And there were many that thought slavery was fine where it existed, but just don't want it to spread to all this new territory. And of course, slave states wanted it to expand. So, the 1850s, critical decade heading into the American Civil War. There's going to be several things that happen through that decade that have been brewing for a long time. The seeds have been planted, but in the 1850s, it just gets harder and harder to compromise on the issue of slavery. So, the legacy of the Mexican American War, we did take a ton of territory from Mexico, but this new territory brought with it challenges. Will the new territory be slave? Will it be free? It puts in question the old Missouri Compromise, which had a line that was drawn to the 36th parallel. Plus, the whole idea of trying to add a free state and a slave state at the same time to keep the balance was in jeopardy now. And the Northerners were willing to tolerate slavery where it was at. For the most part, it had been there since the country's beginning, but it's the expansion in the new territories that really worried these northern states. And many people feared that if slavery continued to grow and to prosper in new territories, it would undermine the free workers we have in the United States. It would be hard to compete if you were being paid to work compared to states that were not paying their workers. So the legacy of the Mexican War, while it seems like a giant chunk of land that we get, which it was, it did bring up a lot of issues. So there is a congressman from Pennsylvania, David Wilmot, who says that he's got a bold idea that, hey, how about we don't let slavery spread into any territory that we've taken from Mexico? It does pretty well in the House, but the South has more senators, and it's defeated in the House or in the Senate. Passes the House, defeated in the Senate. And it's an example of how this northern opinion was growing hostile to slavery expanding. Again, they probably didn't like it where it was at, but it was really the issue of expansion into new territories that really upset the South. The election of 1848, again, we see another war hero, Zachary Taylor, who was part of the short-lived Whig Party, and he believed that Congress could not restrict slavery in its territories. Congress didn't have the power to do that. The Democrat, Lewis Cass, was all for just letting the people vote. That's called popular sovereignty. Let the people who move to this new territory decide. And out of retirement comes former President Martin Van Buren. He would say there's going to be no slavery in the territories whatsoever. So this is kind of a three-man race, a former president coming out of retirement. He doesn't really do as well as Taylor because Taylor is a war hero, and a lot of people like Taylor. They like the idea that he was just kind of tough and plain-spoken, and he will win. But he's not going to serve very long as president because he will die a couple years into it. So as we head into the 1850s, we've got Zachary Taylor is our president. And we've got these states that you see on the map here that are shaded. These are really going to be these kind of southern states that will just over the course of 10 years decide that they just can't be in the Union anymore. Now, if you look at this map, you'll notice that Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland, these states have slaves, but they aren't going to leave. They're going to stick in the Union. And that will make it great and complicated for the Union. But we'll talk more about that in a moment. But let's think about the Civil War as this giant storm that's coming that's going to really destroy America, and it's going to force a rebirth. So if we think of it as like this idea that there's several big storm clouds that roll in through the 1850s that will cause America really to have to reckon with its greatest struggle, which is how do we treat slaves? If we have slaves, will slavery spread? Maybe we shouldn't have it at all. This was a debate that was going on back when they were writing the Constitution in 1787. But now we've just put it off for too long. We've got to deal with slavery. But all through the 1850s, this issue is going to become bigger and bigger, and finally there'll be a civil war to do away with slavery. So the first issue, really, the first storm cloud that comes rolling in the 1850s is this compromise of 1850. We have always been able to compromise all through American history. That's been our thing, but it's getting harder and harder to do. Now that we have California, thanks to the gold rush, when gold is discovered in California in 1848, and of course all the 49ers moved there the year later, California just pops. In fact, it just really skips the whole territory phase. It becomes ready to be a state within just a couple years. Will California, the crown jewel of what we've taken from Mexico, will it be slave or will it be free? And not everyone's going to find gold in California, but people will go there and make a life either as a farmer, or they'll open a grocery store, or they'll make something. California is going to be big and it'll become a state right away. What kind of state will it be? Well, that brings us really to this compromise. There's two men that are at the heart of it. Henry Clay, we've talked about again and again. He's been around really since the War of 1812, being a leader. He's about ready to fade away from American history. He's been a leader in the House, a leader in the Senate. He's run for president 4 times. This is kind of his last big thing. Of course, the new guy in town is the senator from the state of Illinois, Stephen Douglas. Together, these two will work out the Compromise of 1850. Henry Clay is a Whig. Stephen Douglas is a Democrat. They'll work together. It'll be a little complicated getting this through the Congress. Stephen Douglas is pretty good at being a member of the Congress, and he works out a series of bills that collectively we call the Compromise of 1850. So in a compromise, you don't get everything you want. You get some of what you want, and the other side gets some of what it wants. So in the Compromise of 1850, what makes the North happy is that California would be admitted to the Union as a free state, and there will be no more slave trade in Washington, D.C., meaning you could still have slaves in the nation's capital. You just can't buy or sell slaves in the nation's capital. Many thought it was disgusting that foreign leaders might come, or people from other countries walk the streets of our capitals and walk by slave trading going on and slave auction and things. So the North really wanted to get rid of slave trade in Washington, D.C. What the South gets is that Congress would not pass laws about slavery in the new territory. We'll just let the people there decide if they want to be slave or not. And they get a stronger, newer Fugitive Slave Act. So runaway slaves now will it will be harder for the runaway slaves to find freedom. In the past, they could make it to a northern state like Ohio or New York and they'd be free. But under this new law, there is no place in America that a fugitive slave, a runaway slave from the South, would be safe. You would have to go all the way to Canada if you wanted to be truly free and you're a runaway slave. So this makes the South happy. They can track down, and the North will help track down these runaway slaves in Pennsylvania or Ohio or whatever and bring them back to the South. So the Compromise of 1850, here's a map that you can see that California is now part of the free states, and the southern states with slaves, they are happy about the idea that maybe slavery will spread into the New Mexico territory, Utah territory, any unorganized territory. And they're also happy about this new runaway slave, the Fugitive Slave Act, as part of the Compromise of 1850. So that seems to put the issue to rest, except, the idea that slavery would be determined by popular sovereignty just really is not going to make the North happy at all. And they're never really going to be able to be comfortable with this idea, even though it was part of this compromise. It's not something they're going to be happy with. Cause number 2, another storm cloud that comes rolling in a few years later, is when Harriet Beecher Stowe writes this book. It's really, fiction, but it's based on what she knows, what's going on in the South about how slaves are treated. And many people in the North had heard of slavery, they knew it existed, but it didn't really come crashing into their world until they read this book by Uncle Tom called Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Here she is when she's young, there she is when she's old. It really does highlight all of the terrible wrongs of slavery and brings the nation a little closer to this war, because people in the North now, they read this and they are shocked of what, if this is how it is, they can't even believe it. And we certainly don't want this to spread. If this is how it is in Georgia, that's terrible, but we don't want this to spread to new states. And so this book, this is before you could watch videos or you could watch TV. Books and articles and the newspaper and magazines really were a way of getting your case out, making a case for something. And Harriet Beecher Stowe does a wonderful job of highlighting the wrongs of slavery. Of course, this will wake up the North, and then she would be detested in the South. But she will sell hundreds of thousands of copies, and this will basically be her income for the rest of her life. It is probably the most important piece of fiction in American history. But again, it's based on reality. So the characters might be fictitious, but the institution of slavery and how slaves were treated was true. And so America, especially the northern states, starts to wake up to what's happening in these slave states. While this is going on, we mentioned that Zachary Taylor was president. He's president for just a couple years. In the summer of 1850, he is out on a really hot day in July while they're working on dedicating the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. He eats a lot of cherries and ice milk, and something happens to his tummy. We don't really know exactly, but he will die. And of course, that means the vice president would take over. The vice president, Millard Fillmore, he's from New York. I would say he and Zachary Taylor are not really close at all. They barely spoke, but he did balance the ticket. Millard Fillmore, being from the North, helped kind of bring some Northern votes when Zachary Taylor was running. But Millard Fillmore is no Zachary Taylor. He sees things very differently. He will be really critical in getting the Compromise of 1850 passed. He will enforce the runaway slave law, the Fugitive Slave Act. So he is kind of a Northerner who tends to be siding with a lot of these southern states. Not much can be really said about Millard Fillmore. He did open up our interaction with Japan, though. He sent an envoy over there to kind of deal with Japan and start to be friendly with them. But overall, relatively ineffective dealing with slavery and whether it would spread. But then again, I'm not sure what anybody could have really done. You're not going to make everybody happy on this. The next president, Franklin Pierce, is a Democrat from New Hampshire, and he also is not going to make any friends. He's not going to have a very popular presidency. And after 4 years, he'll be out as well. But both of these men are trying to hold the Union together. They're trying to make the southern states happy. They will be enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. They're going to do what they can do to follow the law. But in the end, generally considered kind of ineffective. But really, I don't know what any president could have done in the 1850s to prevent what's happening with slavery. This third storm cloud that comes rolling in is the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This law would allow the people who moved into this new territory to just vote on whether they want to have slaves or not. It's called popular sovereignty. And you can see from this map, it's this hot zone out in Kansas and Nebraska. Just let the people decide. It sounds so American and democratic. Just let the people decide. Sometimes the people don't get it right. Sometimes democracy is more than letting the people decide, because what about the minorities? They trample on the minority. Just because you let the majority do what they want, sometimes it comes at the expense of the minority. And of course, this idea of popular sovereignty would replace the Missouri Compromise that took place in 1820 when James Monroe was president. Remember, they drew this line and said in the future, anything north of it would be free, and anything south of the line would be slave. And now Kansas and Nebraska is north of that line, but we're going to let them vote on it. So this is not going to make these northern states happy at all. And it's going to lead to cause number 4, which would be bleeding Kansas. If you're just going to let people decide, well, then everybody from both sides will move to the Kansas territory and try to outnumber the other side. And it will lead to violence, a period of 2 or 3 years of bloodshed as both sides clash over whether or not slavery will exist in Kansas. Most famously associated with Bleeding Kansas is an abolitionist. Most people would say extreme radical abolitionist, because he was willing to do whatever it takes. If that meant killing, it meant that he would do that. John Brown had spent his whole life being devout Christian and knew in his heart that slavery was wrong, and he understood that it would take violence. So in 1856, in May, there's a lot of violence going on and burning of houses and things in the anti-slavery town of Lawrence, Kansas. So Kansas starts to get developed basically as 2 separate worlds. There's the slavery aspect of Kansas and the anti-slavery part of Kansas. And then in 1856, John Brown is involved in a massacre, Potawatomi massacre, where John Brown will murder 5 pro-slavery men. So people who moved there to push for slavery. John Brown is there to end slavery, and he doesn't care if he has to kill a few people or hundreds to do it. He knew his cause was righteous. So over 200 people would die in the slavery related fighting in Kansas. John Brown really is the kind of the epitome, this famous painting of John Brown. And, obviously this was painted once the Civil War has already started, but you can see that just the storm and the fire, and, John Brown's got the Bible in one hand and a gun in the other, and he just looks like kind of a crazy, dirty mountain Santa who's really ready to do whatever it takes to end slavery. And this is not the only time we're going to talk about John Brown in the 1850s. He's probably one of the most famous people in the 1850s, especially when it comes to bringing about the Civil War. So while all that's going on out in Kansas, at the same time, we got people in Washington, D.C. attacking each other, fighting. And today, we always think that today that Congress is so dysfunctional. Well, this is nothing compared to the years prior to the Civil War. In 1856, a congressman, Preston Brooks of South Carolina, will come into the Senate chamber and attack Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, hitting him in the head over and over again with his cane because of what Charles Sumner said about a senator from South Carolina who happened to be related to Brooks a day or so before. So there was violence in the Capitol building. Brooks is incapacitated for several years, concussion, it was a severe beating. And you would think, you would think that this would be the end of it, but it's not really. It continues to go on, this idea of violence and anger towards each other. So just to be clear, in case I might have said that it would be Brooks of South Carolina who attacked Sumner, and Sumner is going to be incapacitated for several years, and it will be Brooks that will be slightly reprimanded, but would be reelected in his own state of South Carolina. They're happy for what he did. And while all this is going on, we have a new president, James Buchanan of Pennsylvania. Buchanan had been kind of out of the country for a while when all of the stuff was happening in the Kansas. And so he's a kind of just someone who was considered to be safe. He didn't really have a lot of opinions on things. He'll win the election, but he's going to have a difficult presidency because obviously the country is on the brink of war. And he is a northerner, but he tends to always side with the South. And in the few months right before the Civil War, he's not going to take action to arm Fort Sumter. And, when he could have sent troops to reinforce that, he didn't do anything to crush any talk of secession in the South. He just kind of let things happen. And so generally considered a weak and ineffective president. And he's going to be president for these last few years before the Civil War. Cause number 5, a Supreme Court case called the Dred Scott case. Most likely, most often considered one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever. In 1857, the Chief Justice, Roger Taney, from Maryland, a southern state, decides that Dred Scott is property. Dred Scott had sued because he was taken to a free state for a while and then back to a slave state. He said that because he was in a free state for a while, he was free. And this case really highlights the position that the South had, which is that slaves are property, they are not citizens, they have no standing in court. This was a huge blow to the abolitionists, and many Southerners were extremely happy with Roger Taney. Most recently, the state of Maryland has started removing Roger Taney from their state house. Their statues and things were removed because of his position on the Dred Scott case in 1857. But this is going to make the South happy. It's going to embolden the South and the North, and the abolitionists are going to be upset and this is going to push them a little closer to war. Just to recap some of the famous people of the 1850s, Stephen Douglas, the senator from Illinois, is all about popular sovereignty. He seems to be the up-and-coming leader of the country. So we've got Stephen Douglas at Illinois, and of course John Brown in Kansas, causing all kinds of problems. These two men really are probably the big heavy hitters of the 1850s. And it's hard to think about American history in that decade without John Brown and Stephen Douglas. Cause number 6, speaking of Stephen Douglas, he decides he wants to run for re-election in 1858 for the Senate. And in those days, to become a senator, you needed your state government to vote for you to be your senator. So Douglas will run against this new up-and-coming one-term House of Representative member, Abraham Lincoln. And remember, Stephen Douglas is a heavyweight. He was responsible for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He was involved in the Compromise of 1850. He is one of the leading men in American politics. But he is going to have to take on this up-and-coming Republican, Abraham Lincoln. And they will debate throughout the state of Illinois through the summer and fall. And the debates between these two will talk about slavery and whether it should spread or not. It wasn't really so much whether slavery should end. Lincoln was not willing to say, at least at first, that slavery needed to end everywhere. It was that slavery should not spread, whereas Stephen Douglas would say, let the people decide. This is America, popular sovereignty. And in the end, the winner is, Stephen Douglas wins. Abraham Lincoln, what a loser. But the country starts to know and hear about Abraham Lincoln and what he's saying. And of course, 2 years later, he's going to come back and win the presidency against Stephen Douglas. Cause number 7 is our old friend, John Brown, who'd been out in Kansas, now comes back to kind of Ohio and Virginia area. He spends a little time in Ohio organizing what would be a raid in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, the government gun factory, and where we store guns there. Today it would be in West Virginia. But John Brown plans this in Ohio, and he plans, remember this kind of wild, crazy, dirty Mountain Santa abolitionist, John Brown, organizes this attack on this town that's got a government gun factory and a storage of government guns and weapons in 1859. He and a group of men were going to attack the town, take some captives, grab some guns, and hope to arm the people and the slaves of this part of Virginia in an uprising that would seek to end slavery everywhere in the country. He understood that you can't compromise on this. Only bloodshed would end slavery. Of course, John Brown is captured. He's in a firehouse held up there when the Army arrives. Well, technically the Marines arrive, led by Robert E. Lee, who is in the Army, but he's leading the Marines. They smash in the door of the firehouse. They find John Brown, and he is obviously arrested. There's a trial. This is in October when he is attacking, and there'll be a trial, and he's going to be executed on December 2nd of 1859. One of the things that John Brown says right before he's executed is, I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. I had vainly flattered myself without very much bloodshed it might be done, but he understands that it will take a lot of blood. The Civil War is going to be needed to end the slavery in this country. So John Brown is executed, but he stirs things up in Kansas. He stirs things up in Virginia. Seems like he's everywhere, and he's getting the country to face the reality. In the South, they see John Brown as a wackadoodle, crazy, extreme Northerner. See, this is what the Northerners are going to do. In the North, they start to see him as a martyr, someone who understands the writing on the wall and is willing to die to end slavery. And he does die to end slavery. So today, we look back at John Brown and say, yeah, that guy was right all along. And of course, the final event that's going to lead to the Civil War, the country is on edge from everything we've talked about, whether it's Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, John Brown in Kansas, John Brown in Virginia, the Senate race in Illinois, the Compromise of 1850, Dred Scott, all of these things, Bleeding Kansas, all of this is leading up to this election in 1860 that when the South sees Lincoln elected, they're like, this is the end for us. Now, Lincoln had never said that he's going to march in the South and destroy slavery where it existed, but that's what the Southerners believed. Lincoln had always said it's terrible, but it can stay where it's at. But once Lincoln's elected, once the war begins, then he will make it an aim of the country. But at first, not so much. If you look at this election map, you can see Lincoln wins by winning these northern states, and the southern states are all divided up by different parties. We're on the verge of a civil war here, but Lincoln gets his revenge against Douglas, who barely gets any electoral votes, but he gets quite a bit of the popular vote. Breckinridge is a Southern Democrat, and Bell is a constitutional unionist. But it doesn't matter. They divide the vote 4 ways, and Lincoln wins. He gets a majority in the Electoral College. He's elected in November. He will be sworn in March of 1861. And in that window between his election and his swearing in, the southern states are freaking out. They will have conventions where they will be voting to secede when Lincoln takes over. They'll be making plans to attack any kind of Union forts. Fort Sumter in South Carolina is trying to get ready because it's a tiny little dot now surrounded by South Carolina that desperately wants to secede. And it would be James Buchanan who doesn't really act during this lame duck period. But, hindsight is 20/20, I guess. But Lincoln, when he is sworn in soon after, will have states formally seceding and shots fired. The Civil War is underway.